Hi Booktube, it's Amy, and I'm here with the final chapter of The Kingdom of Books by Orcutt. And this is called A Personality and a Shrine. Some wise writer once said that a man's personality is explained by his work, and it is equally true that a man's work is better understood by knowing something of his personality. Ever since I became interested in the old-time worthies of the book, I have been conscious of a vast difference in the vividness of their characterization. Fust and Schoeffer, Gutenberg and Jensen, the Etiennes, the Elzevers, and even so recent a celebrity as John Baskerville, seem to me almost legendary figures of the far distant past. The Letters of Indulgence of 1454, the Mazarin Bible of 1456, the Aesopus of 1470 and the Royal Greeks of 1540, the Terence of 1635 and the Virgil of 1757, are tangible evidences that they really existed. But the heroes themselves are so merged with their work as almost to lose individuality. On the other hand, there are others who have come to be as real to me as those artist-printers whom I have personally known. Christophe Plantin is one of the stellar lights in typography with whom I seem to have an intimate acquaintance. I know that experts classify him as belonging to the second rather than to the first group of great artist-printers, but I cannot help feeling that although his product averaged below the quality of Eldis or of Robert Etienne, that his contribution to the book was in a way as great. Printing in the 16th century had changed from an art to a liberal art, and Plantin, by proving himself a liberal artist and a practical businessman, met the conditions of the period as he found them, and through his courage, his public spirit, and his imagination, he held his work true to his ideals, and far above that of any printer of his epoch. The first time I visited the Plantin Moretus Museum at Antwerp years ago, I had little knowledge of old Christophe's history, so naturally I found in that historic shrine simply an astonishing number of typographic and other exhibits which contributed much in interest and information, not only to a maker of books, but to the casual tourist. As a result of the impressions produced by that visit, I received an incentive to become better acquainted with Plantin himself, and later visits have proved veritable pilgrimages as to a shrine from which I have always gained encouragement and inspiration. I wish I might make Christophe Plantin appear as real to you as he does to me. His portrait, which hangs in the second drawing room of the museum, painted for his son-in-law, Jean Moretus, the first, makes a physical visualization possible. The short cropped hair and beard, the strong nose and piercing eyes, the firm but kindly mouth, which seems to smile a welcome, the white linen goffered collar over the black coat, adds a picturesque touch of antiquity to the quiet dignity, while the expression on the face and the confidence in bearing give evidence that the great master printer not only was fully aware of his preeminence, but knew what he knew. And here is the portrait of Christophe Plantin. And on the next page here, we have the courtyard of the Plantin Moretus Museum. All modern book builders should be drawn to him by a common bond of sympathy, for many of the problems he had to meet and solve are the same as those we have been forced to recognize. In the 15th century, Eldis competed against the hand-lettered volume. In the 16th, as in the 19th century, the competition was against inferior workmanship and materials. It requires even more courage to maintain a high degree of excellence when the world is satisfied with mediocrity than to produce well-made books because readers demand them. Thank heaven that the 20th century has developed so definite a demand for printing as an art. I remember once hearing the head of one of our best-known private presses remark, "I don't expect to make money out of my printing. I should be ashamed to do that." This printer has an independent income which explains his ability to be indifferent to the financial return. During the existence of his press, he has maintained a wonderfully high average in quality and has thus contributed conspicuously to the present public appreciation. Typography in America and England owes him a deep debt of gratitude for his material unselfishness in putting into his work more than he hopes to draw out of it. Yet printing to exist must recognize the economic relation of cost and price. Eldis and the Etiennes produced wonderful volumes, but barely eked out an existence. John Baskerville began his career as a printer with a fortune made out of the Japanese business and died a poor man. Christophe Plantin lost money on his masterpiece, the Polyglot Bible, but left his family a comfortable fortune of over $200,000 and maintained his position as the greatest printer of his time by putting quality into low-cost books. It is not usual to associate romance or beauty with a printing office, yet the relics of the Plantin press exhibited in Antwerp represent both. The thousands of visitors who pass through the various rooms are attracted by more than the portraits or the furniture or the presses or the types, but what the appeal is few possibly could clearly state. Some know nothing of the significance of this collection, most know little. It is the intangible lure of the book, and those who yield themselves to it receive back in proportion to their understanding. The last time I was at the museum in 1924, as I stepped into the entrance hall, I felt, even more strongly than before, a curious sensation of finding myself a part of the 16th century, having left all 20th century atmosphere checked with my cane at the entrance door. Although only a portion of the present museum represents the original home in which Plantin lived, the additions and changes made by his successors have been so completely in accord with his own conception that it requires no stretch of the imagination to consider him a part of it all. There is a bit of mystery about Christophe's birth. Even the date has been a matter of discussion. On his tombstone, the year 1914 is recorded, while in an inscription beneath an engraved portrait of his father-in-law, Franciscus Raphelianus, states emphatically that May 1520 is the correct date, calling attention to a letter from Christophe to the magistrates of Antwerp dated 30 April 1582, in which Plantin declares that at the time he was 62 years old. Some claim that Christophe was the son of the famous Charles de Tiercelin, while others, with equal vehemence, maintain that his father was a townsman of Saint Averton and a small hamlet near Tours in France. The latter theory is probably correct, and the confusion perhaps arises from the fact that the boy's mother died of the plague while he was still very young, and his father moved to Lyons to escape the contagion, later going on to Orleans and to Paris. Little Christophe was left behind in Lyons with a small sum of money in the care of Claude Perret, audienceur of the Church of Saint Just. This was the last the youngster ever saw or heard of his father. He grew up with Perret's own son, Peter, whom he loved as a brother, until he grew old enough to strike out for himself. From this point on, the records are fairly clear. Young Christophe apprenticed himself to Robert Massey, printer in Caen, where he remained until after his marriage in 1546, then going on to Paris in search of fortune. Here he was reunited with his foster brother, Peter Perret, and their Damon and Pythias relationship at this time undoubtedly gave rise to the unplausible theory that both boys were sons of Charles de Tiercelin. This famous nobleman died, so the story goes, leaving behind him little save glory and the two boys, proud of their birth and unwilling to cast a shadow on the illustrious coat of arms by engaging in trade. They assumed the names of two plants, the plantain and the leek, or in French, Plantin and Perret. Christophe setting up a bookshop in Antwerp, to which he added bookbinding and the making of ornamental bookcases for books, while Peter became an apothecary. Those who are familiar with the glories of the Etiennes may well wonder why Christophe, a Frenchman and a printer, should have left Paris when the opportunity would seem to be at hand to continue the work which had made France supreme in the art of printing. But that is to forget the censorship which made the printer's life so irksome. Henry II ascended the French throne just at this time, and one of his earliest pronouncements was that he would recognize heresy as high treason. Delay, condemned publisher, was hanged and then burned at the stake. Robert Etienne, master printer to the new king's father, escaped with his life, only by fleeing to Geneva. This made the youthful Christophe pause and think, with the result that he considered discretion the better part of valor, and selected as an abiding place that city which welcomed immigration, and at that time surpassed Paris and even London in commerce, wealth, and artistic appreciation. The latter part of the Plantin-Perret story, at least, is substantiated. Christophe prospered in his little Antwerp shop, and his jewel boxes, his cases, his bindings, and his mosaics became famous. His customers included personages of high degree, among them no less than the secretary to King Philip II of Spain. Gabriel de Caus, it was through a commission given Christophe by this patron that an unhappy accident occurred. The secretary had secured a valuable stone intended as a gift to his royal master, and desiring a fitting case in which to enclose the gem, he gave the commission to Plantin. One night at dusk, having completed the task, Plantin set out to deliver the precious casket, preceded by a servant carrying a torch. Suddenly he was set upon by a band of masked ruffians who mistook him for a guitar player, whom they sought to punish for some offence. The defenceless victim was grievously stabbed, while the miscreants made good their escape. Old Farinalius, highly famed as a surgeon with the aid of Dr. Gorifus Bucanus, succeeded in saving Plantin's life, but his right hand had forever lost its usefulness. I like to think that it was fate that brought Christophe Plantin to abandon the manufacture of gadgets, no matter how artistic, and return to the making of books. But at any rate, the history of printing was distinctly altered by this accident. Even during the same year, 1555, Plantin issued his first publication, a little volume in Italian and French. From that moment he forged steadily ahead, leaving other printers far behind. There is something splendid in this determination with which Christophe met adversity and conquered it, but he needed all his courage, for Nemesis seemed to pursue him without mercy. The death struggle had begun between the church, the state, and press, and Plantin had inadvertently placed himself in the very centre of the battleground. In 1562 a tract was issued from Plantin's office, which the Margrave of Antwerp declared to be heretical. 3 of Plantin's workmen, and Plantin himself, in absentio, he being in Paris at the time, were condemned, and his property was seized and sold at auction. Later, Plantin was able to prove that the offending treatise had been printed without his knowledge, but the workmen were sent to the galleys. Fortunately, his friends had bought in most of the property when sold at auction, so the harassed printer was not hopelessly ruined. But the persecution was coming too close. He preferred the galleys of the printing office to the galleys of the Spaniards, so during the next year he found refuge in Paris. Then, the tempest having subsided, he returned to Antwerp and formed one of the earliest printing and publishing associations, including his loyal friends Charles and Corneille Bomberg, the latter a famous type-cutter, Jacques de Chauty, and the same Dr. Bucanus, who had previously saved his life. Plantin became the managing director of the company. This partnership lasted only 4 years, lightning again striking in the form of heresy charges, this time against the Bomberg brothers and Dr. Chauty, who had to fly for their lives. Then, through the good offices of his old patron at the bookshop, Gabriel de Caus, still King Philip's secretary, Plantin came fully under the protection of the king himself. I have an idea that old Christophe eventually possessed a very mixed sentiment concerning King Philip, for while the king was indirectly the occasion for Plantin's later fortune, for many years he was the direct cause of many of his tribulations. Plantin announced his desire to produce a polyglot Bible, and the patrons of the art of printing of Frankfurt, Heidelberg, and even Paris overwhelmed him with proposals to be associated with the great work. King Philip had no idea of letting any such honor escape him, so, pushing the others aside, he agreed to subsidize this momentous undertaking by paying Plantin some $34,000 in exchange for 12 copies of the completed work, printed upon vellum, and these 12 copies would require more skins than there were in the entire extent of the Low Countries. Unfortunately, the coffers of the king were nearly as empty as those of the private citizens who came under his domination. So the promises meant nothing, and Plantin suddenly discovered himself, with his polyglot Bible well underway, hopelessly involved in financial complications. With his other hand, King Philip made the gesture of securing for Plantin a license from the Holy See, little realizing that the monopoly thus granted would eventually more than atone for his financial defaults. During the 200 years of this license, the Plantin office turned out literally millions of missals, breviaries, durals, psalters, antiphanaries, and offices of the Virgin. If monarchs in those days were afflicted with consciences, this may explain why King Philip was led to make farther amends by appointing Plantin prototypographer. This was in 1570, when the great printer was 50 years old and at the height of his fame. There was no remuneration from the office, nor direct advantage beyond, perhaps, the freedom it gave him from the burden of housing soldiers, but indirectly it placed Plantin in a position where he could prevent other printers from issuing volumes of questionable orthodoxy, while he himself was limited by no such restrictions. I do not mean to suggest that Plantin ever took advantage of the situation, yet one must admit that the temptation must have been great. But the position surely kept him in touch with what his rivals were doing. By the year 1576, Plantin's office had grown to 22 presses, with 150 employees and a payroll of 200 gold crowns a day. And this year, Christophe, with characteristic boldness, or rashness, moved the entire establishment to the present site of the museum. Within 6 months, the Spanish fury burst upon Antwerp. King Philip's unpaid soldiers had rebelled at last and took reprisals on the unoffending citizens. 9 times, Christophe complained bitterly, did I have to pay ransom to save my property from destruction. It would have been cheaper to have abandoned it. For 8 or 9 years, business was practically at a standstill, and the city never fully recovered from the results of the devastation. At no time was the work in the Plantin office wholly stopped, but frequently only a single press would be running instead of the full quota of 22. Christophe endured this situation until 1583, when, despairing of peace and urged by his good friend Lippius, the historian, formerly a corrector at the Plantin office, he left his press in charge of his sons-in-law and went to Leiden, where he became printer to the new university where William Orange had given the city which William of Orange had given that city in recognition of the courageous resistance of the inhabitants to the Spanish assaults. Louis Elzevir, who became a foreman of this new Leyden office, was the first of that famous family to appear in typographical records. 2 years later, the Duke of Palma recaptured Antwerp, and although Plantin had declared he would never return, the urge of the golden compasses was too strong, and he resumed his old-time labors. The attractive name of the golden compasses, with which Plantin had christened his establishment, had its origin in the famous device adopted for the Plantin office, the hand emerging from a cloud, grasping a pair of compasses standing on one foot, with the other turning, while a ribbon floats gracefully between the 2 points, on which are inscribed the words Labor et Constantia. On one side stands Hercules, symbolizing labor, on the other a woman personifying constancy. And even the compasses themselves express the same thought, the turning arm representing labor, while the arm at rest is constant. It was here in the Marche de Vendredi, where the museum now stands, that the battle-scarred veteran spent the last 4 years of his life. When Plantin originally took the property over from Martin Lopez in 1576, the frontage was on the Hoogstraat, near the old St. Janspoort, and the white stone front and entrance, which the visitor sees today, built by Francois Jean Moradis nearly 2 centuries later, was then only an unpretentious gateway. And here is that famous device just described on the last page. After the Spanish fury swept over Antwerp, the estate was cut in two, and Plantin occupied that portion with the garden which opened out onto the Mardi de Vendredi. In this garden he erected 3 buildings, converting a coach house into a 4th, and here he housed his printing establishment. How he loved to ring in the changes on the Plantin mark. One of the buildings he called the iron compasses, another the wooden compasses, a third the copper compasses, and finally the silver compasses. By what magic form of alchemy he amalgamated these into the composite gold compasses, producing the finest volumes of any printing office in the world, is explained by his motto, Labor et Constania. The iron compasses and the wood compasses now comprise the Folklore Museum, where the copper compasses and the silver compasses form part of the present museum. The printing shop, as we see it today, was added by Plantin in 1579. The inventory of 1575 still exists, showing that at that time Plantin possessed 38,128 pounds of cast type, divided into 73 different fonts. When he died 14 years later, the type room in Antwerp contained 44,605 pounds of type, and the branch office in Leyden had 4,042 pounds. In 1565, Plantin owned 7 presses, 10 years later 15, in 1576, 22, but after the Spanish fury he sold 7 of them. Even the remaining 15 constituted a very large office for that time. The Etiennes, for instance, never had more than 4 presses at work. The greatest production of the Plantin office, the Polyglot Bible, was not made in these buildings, which have now become the Plantin Shrine, but in 2 of the earlier offices called the Golden Unicorn and the Golden Falcon, both situated in the Kammerstraat. Still, it is fitting that the museum should stand in this spot. Even though only Plantin's lesser books were produced here, it was here that he surrounded himself with those things that most interested him in his labors and in his private life. It is this spot which he most impressed with his personality. Old Christophe was fortunate, since he had no son, in having his son-in-law and grandson so competent and so loyal in their efforts to continue his policy and to maintain his high ideals. At his death in 1589, the old man had stipulated that the management of the business should always pass into the hands of that descendant who, in the opinion of the family, was best qualified to handle it, and this injunction was carefully observed. As time went on and generation succeeded generation, the Plantin Moratis family added to the substantial fortune already established. In the 5th generation, Balthazar Moratis III enjoyed the distinction of being created nobleman by King Charles II of Spain, with the special privilege of exercising his profession without derogation of nobility. This is particularly significant, for by the end of the 17th century, printing in general had degenerated into a trade. King Charles recognized in the descendant of Christophe Plantin one who still held fast to the family tradition, that printing was an art, and that as such it might be exercised by nobleman or plebeian with equal grace. Printing was then, as it is today, an art or a trade, according to the approach made to it by the printer. The successors of Balthazar III managed the business with diminishing ability until 1866. By that time, all the concessions had been lost, and the House of Plantin had become saturated with that commercial instinct which made its product no different from that of other printing offices the world over. Edward Jean Hyacinthe Moratis Plantin, great-great-grandson of Balthazar III, was its head, and he was sufficiently far removed from the ideals of old Christophe by the intervening 3 centuries to be willing to consider closing the establishment and even to permit possession to pass from the family. Gradually, rumors spread around Antwerp that he was negotiating for the sale of the property, and a small group of Belgians who realized what the Plantin traditions meant to Antwerp and to Belgium became alarmed by the prospect of having this historic plant transferred bodily to some other country. These patrons placed the situation squarely before the national government, and the municipal authorities, finding an immediate response. After some political complications, a plan was devised whereby the state and the city combined to purchase the property for 1,200,000 francs. This was in 1876, just 300 years after Christophe acquired the property. Thus, fortunately, was established for all time this priceless exhibit of the home and the workshop of the greatest printer of the period. Can you wonder that I feel old Christophe's personality when I visit this historic shrine? Even more than that of any of his successors, though the Moratis family occupied the property for several generations. Nothing exists today which so clearly shows how closely in those times a man's business was associated with his home life. Even though the family drawing rooms and bedrooms are now filled with cases containing autograph letters and papers and historic souvenirs, no one can fail to receive the intangible impression that the former occupants are not far distant. To some visitors, the greatest interest centers in the 16th century furniture and tapestries in the drawing room and chambers. To some, the portraits by Rubens and other artists contribute in creating or establishing personalities. To the printer or to the lover of books, these interests are but secondary. There is a fascination in studying the external and internal influences expressed in any great masterpiece. A famous engineer who is about to plan a bridge makes himself familiar with the structures which have preceded him, and gains knowledge and inspiration that enable him to surpass previous effort. The architect approaches a new building project in the same way. Thus, Plantin, before undertaking his Polyglot Bible, made an exhaustive examination of earlier volumes of similar nature, and I like nothing better than to handle these very publications, to discover in them those features he adopted, and to note the pitfalls he avoided. In addition to the Latin of the Gutenberg Bible, Plantin had to consider the addition of 3 other parallel columns in Greek, Hebrew, and Chaldee. Instead of being a straightforward printing and publishing problem, the text of the new Bible had to be insured against heretical paragraphs. To gain the whole story, I must go back and forth between the tapestry drawing room, where the volumes are exhibited, and the license room, where I might study the documents which had to be secured before Plantin's publication could be issued. Showing that in the case of the Polyglot Bible, for instance, permission was obtained only after 5 tedious years of diplomacy. And in the meantime, more capital than he possessed was locked up in the inactive volumes. I like to linger in the proofreader's room and compare old Christophe's problems with those of his predecessors and successors. I am sitting in the very chair where Franciscus Raphaelicus, Plantin's son-in-law, the most accomplished corrector, used to direct that important side of the production. A great scholar was Raphaelingius, formerly professor in the University of Cambridge in England. He had to supervise and edit manuscripts in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, French, German, Spanish, Italian, Flemish, Dutch, and English, and he commanded the largest salary of any member of Plantin's staff, no less than the equivalent of $640 a year. And at the time of publication here, there's a footnote. The purchasing power of money in the 16th century is estimated at about 10 times its present value. So you can only imagine how much that would be worth today, almost 100 years after the publication of Orcutt's book. Faithful old Calenus, 50 years in service, author of Latin poems, writer of prefaces, translator of manuscripts, and compiler of a Flemish dictionary, never received over $6.40 a week, and one of the younger Plantin daughters who held copy even in foreign languages before they were 12 years old. Yet the correctors received a princely income compared with the compositors, who averaged perhaps $200 a year, and a workday which began at 5 o'clock in the morning with no hour set for closing. And there were deductions to be made even from this meager income. A fine for errors exceeding 6 letters, splendid notion, 64 cents for initiation fee with monthly payments of $2.40 a month to the poor box. The binders received 8 cents a copy for the labor on an octavo sheepskin volume, 12 cents for a folio, and from 56 to 88 cents for a folio in full calf. The large skins of vellum included in the Polyglot Bible cost $3.60 a dozen. The Plantin authors also were less exacting than at present. The careful records of the establishment, running unbroken from 1555 until the end of 1864, disclose the fact that Jean Isaac, in 1554, received in full for the copyright of his Hebrew grammar 100 copies of the book, and that Statius, for his commentaries on Florus, in 1567, was paid $32. And so it goes. The press correctors and revisers received all the way from board and lodging and $96 a year to $336. All this explains why the humane Salatus Mementa of Arius Montanus was 72 plates could be sold in a little shop for $4.20, and even the famous Polyglot Bible in 8 volumes for $112 with a 15% discount to book-selling customers. No wonder that a Plantin octavo Virgil brought only 40 cents. I wander through the type foundry, attracted by the mold with which old Christophe cast his characters. I wonder if he would have been interested in the modern facilities for securing machine-made type, with only that effort required to dictate a letter or to make a telephone call. I suspect he would still prefer the prestige of owning the exclusive designs made for him by Robert Grandjean or Julian Lebay, and cut by Guyot or Van Everbrocht, even though he had to cast the characters laboriously by hand, using his own molds and punches. In those days, a printer's type brought him as much reputation as his work and expressed his own personality. When I enter the press room, I instinctively listen for the rumble made by the revolutions of the cylinders. But even had Plantin's full quota of 22 presses been at work, I should have heard only the fall of the type and frames upon the bars. The last time I was there, a single press was turning out the souvenir copies of Christophe's famous sonnet, The Happiness of This World, composed in the original Plantin's type. But 2 of old Christophe's original presses still remain, and the same in principle as those used in our day by Cober Sanderson at the Doves Press, and capable of printing sheets as creditably as can be produced with all our boasted material advancement. We have here a drawing by Joseph Pennell of the press room. And we have here Martine Plantin, wife of Jean Mortis I and one of the shop girls of the Plantin press. And I expect that the women in this family had quite a lot to do within the business, but not a lot said about them here. But the hints I'm getting here is that they were taking quite a large role and performing quite a bit of labor within the family business, which would be interesting to learn about, but I'm not sure if I'm going to be finding anything about that. The editions printed on these presses were not as small as I had supposed. Plantin never issued less than 1,250 copies without a subsidy, and of the Patuk in Hebrew he ran 3,900 copies. The little bookshop dispensed only a fraction of his output, copies being sold by booksellers at fairs or in other cities. Being sold, perhaps Plantin would have admitted that Alderson Robert Etienne had maintained a higher average in quality, but he might well have added with a touch of pride, "I have proved for all time to come that quality and low-cost books can be made practical." The little bookshop where Martin and Madeleine Plantin used to serve as shop girls, at present contains framed exhibits, but as I stand there I can easily imagine the trained scholars and learned men who passed in and out the narrow door, examining and taking away with them the precious volumes. From the stern Duke of Alba to the black-robed professors and the students from the universities, all seeking the power that comes from the knowledge that is in books. Perhaps modern bookstores might count upon better patronage if they employed shop girls clad in the quaint goffered collars and linen headdresses passed down to posterity in the portraits of the Plantin daughters. There is a side to Christophe Plantin that is little known, but which might be suspected after a careful study of his eyes and mouth. Back of all his cleverness as a businessman, in spite of all his practicality in handling the perplexities arising from his printing and his publishing, he was full of temperament and always felt the urge to express himself in poetic meter. Few of the visitors to the museum who purchase for a souvenir the little leaf on which the sonnet, "The Happiness of This World," is printed on an ancient hand press in the original Plantin type, realize that this is a masterpiece competing with the Polyglot Bible in establishing Christophe's enduring fame. No poem was so imitated during the 17th century, and this sincerest form of flattery has occasioned much discussion as to Plantin's rights to the credit of authorship. The latest contributing evidence of Maurits Sabie, one-time director of the Plantin Moretus Museum, seems to remove all reasonable doubt that the sonnet may be taken as an exceptional exposition of the great printer's personality. To have a lovely home, free from the stress of life, a garden wall bedecked with fragrant vine, a modest progeny, a bit of fruit and wine, a model household and a faithful wife, to have no debts, to be at peace with all, single love aside from our relations, to ape no prince, content with expectations, to base our acts on justice great or small, freely to live without undue ambition, to let our faith accomplish its fruition, to hold our passions leashed in full control, to keep our judgment free as passing breath, to tell our beads we're laboring for our soul, and then content await the call of death. And there is the sonnet in the original language. I like to stand in the old courtyard and ruminate on the permanence of the art of printing, as symbolized by the gabled walls rising on all sides, broken only by leaded glass windows. The vines growing so luxuriantly over the bricks and stone find their parent stock in the roots set out by Christophe Plantin over 300 years ago. They are symbolic. Books, of course, will live forever, and while they recall the old-time master printers, our familiarity with them lessens the full realization of that for which they stand. But to see the very types and presses and engravings that have outlived the power of Spain and Austria and France, to be able to follow the detailed records of a printing office with an unbroken succession of over 3 centuries, to become intimately acquainted with the personality so powerful as to be all-enduring, gives a new meaning to Plantin's guiding word stars, labor et constantia.